Hello chess fans, welcome to the Amateur Chess Review, and thank you to Maxwell Smart for sending in this game. You can see both players are rated about 1,000. Let's take a look. White starts with d4, certainly a good move. Black plays e6, which is fine. White plays e4, and we have a French defense. Usually black plays pawn to d5. In this game, black played queen to f6, which is definitely not a good move. Usually, you've probably heard the advice, don't bring your queen out too early in the opening. Typically, it's good advice because your queen can get pushed around and it's going to have to move. In this game, black's plan was also not very good. He was planning after bishop c4 to play e5. For one thing, this pawn has already moved one square. Another point to notice is that actually this bishop's scope is lessened with this pawn on e6. So now with the pawn on e5, it's actually a little stronger. White played knight to f3, which is a good developing move, and black took this pawn. Now, white made a pretty instructive mistake. We can notice here that white has a lead in development. He's got his bishop and his knight out. It's his turn. He's about to castle. Black is a few moves away from castling. So white wants to try to make moves that are going to bring out all his pieces as fast as possible and maybe find a way to make some threats against the enemy king. Now, white played queen takes queen. White plays queen takes pawn, allowing black to play queen takes queen. Now, the thing is, in this position, white's advantage is much smaller. It's nice that the bishop and knight are out and that black doesn't have any pieces out, but there's not going to be a knockout blow anytime soon here. Well, let's see what happened. Black played knight f6, attacking this pawn. The most natural way to defend it is knight c3, bringing out your knight. In general, if you get a position like this, you should always consider pawn to e5. Here, it's not a big deal. Black could move his knight. Also notice, probably not the best move here, but this is often a clever response to pawn to e5, because if you take the knight, they take the bishop, and if they give check, maybe you could go back, or you could block with your pawn. It's not so great here, but it's the kind of move you have to think about always when you get a position like this. Can I play e5? Can black play d5? Well, here white played a bad move. He played bishop g5 and black played knight takes pawn. Material is very important in chess. So here white lost a pawn and it's an ending. So there's not going to be a lot of huge threats against the black king anytime soon. And this bishop is attacked. Now white played f3, which was a blunder, and black took the bishop. Now, right away, if we were to ask the computer to evaluate this position, they would say black is lost, -6. So you might think there's nothing left to discuss, but in most levels of chess, this game is going to go on, and white is not going to lose just because he's down a piece. Played a good move, h4, making a threat. Now, black can easily defend against this threat, but because white has threatened something, it gave black the opportunity to make a mistake. Now, black played bishop c5, which looks like a clever move, attacking the knight. So if white takes the knight, black will take the knight. However, whenever you play a counterattack, rather than defending your pieces, you have to be very careful because you can no longer evaluate the position on general grounds alone. You're going to have to calculate variations. And here, white had a clever way, knight b3, to attack this bishop and still keep attacking this knight, and white is going to win a piece. If black tries to play knight e6, defending the bishop, you're not going to play knight takes bishop. You're going to play bishop e6 first. If black takes it, you're going to play knight takes bishop. And if black tries to be clever and throw in this check, it's fine. You just play pawn to c3. You got out of the check, and you're attacking black's bishop. However, in the game, in this position, white played c3. And black took it, white took it, and black played here. Now, here, of course, white is lost, but he's really trying to find the way to make life as hard as possible for black. I think the best move is pawn to d5, and let's say black moves his knight, threatening this fork of the rook and the king. Maybe you move your king, and you have a little more space here. Maybe you'll be able to bring your rook and check black's king if he forgets to castle. It's not great, but you have to play the position you have. So I think this was the best of the possibilities that existed here. White took this knight, which is further simplification. Now, when you're down material, it could be a pawn or it could be like in this position, a pawn and a bishop, your opponent has a plan to win the game, and that plan is to exchange pieces. Because here, there's still some complication left. But if you got a position where it was king, pawns, and bishop versus king and pawns, the side without the piece would be in quite a bit of trouble and would really have no way to win the game. So it would be pretty awful. Okay, white played knight c3, castles, castles, knight c6, white played knight b5, attacking this pawn, and black played a6. It doesn't really matter too much. Perhaps a little better is bishop d7, simply developing. The point being that if white plays knight takes pawn, black could play his rook to the c file, and it's true that white took this pawn, but this is an open line against white's king, and if white moves his knight, you're going to have some juicy discoveries. Maybe knight takes pawn, check from the rook. Let's see this position though. a6 takes, rook a7. Now, it might seem like white's knight is trapped here. It can't get out on b5, it can't get out on d5, but he always has this resource that he played in the game, pawn to d5. Black moved his knight. Obviously, if he takes it, white could get out with his knight. So knight b4, and white takes, black takes back, white takes it, and black takes back. Notice that it's not a good idea to play knight takes pawn check, taking a pawn with check, because similar to the counterattack before, white plays king b1, and if black takes white's knight, white will take black's knight. So black played the correct move here, and now we get a very interesting and instructive position. Well, black played knight a2 check, and this was pretty much a disaster. White played king b1, and this black knight could not get out. So we're going to reach a rook and pawning that's about equal. But even worse is there's a move screaming out to be played, and that move is knight to d5. Take a look at this knight in the center. It's defended by a pawn, so white cannot take it with his rook unless he's willing to give up a rook for a knight, which would be pretty bad here. You'd end up actually with black having an extra rook. It can't be attacked by a c-pawn. White has no pawn here, and it can't be attacked by an e-pawn. So this knight is going to be very powerful. Sometimes we tell the kids it's called an octopus, because a knight in the center attacks 8 squares, like a octopus has 8 tentacles. Looks pretty good for black, and we'd expect him to go on to win the game, especially because white will have to avoid exchanging rooks, if at all possible. Because when you get a position of king, knight, and pawns against just king and pawns, the black knight will attack white's pawns, and there'll be really no way to defend them. But let's see what happens. Black played knight a2 check, white moved his king. Okay, well now the situation is already radically different. Black's knight is attacked, and it's going to be lost for nothing. If you're going to lose a piece in a situation like this, you definitely have to consider all the different ways it can be lost, and if they can benefit you. For example, you have to think about knight c3 check or knight b4. Even though they both lose a piece, perhaps it will cause white to weaken his position or make a move that's not super favorable for him. Here, for example, it would split up the white pawns. It's not really a big deal, but definitely black has to consider it. Now, in the game, black played pawn to e5. I think he should probably be thinking first and foremost about getting this rook in the game, because it's on a really weird spot. It could come in the game by going back, or possibly by having black move his pawn forward. What happened is pawn to e5, white took the knight, pawn to h6, and now this is already a mistake, because white has a good position. He's got a rook on an open file, and this rook is about to come in the game attacking this pawn, and it's not clear what h6 accomplishes. Sometimes it's important to move a pawn in front of your king to make a square for the king, but here there's already a way for black's king to get out. The real problem is, again, this rook on a7. So I think rook a8 would be okay, or maybe instead of rook a8, you could play b5, getting the rook in the game in kind of a clever way. In the game, what happened is h6 and rook e1. That's a good move. White should also consider rook d7, getting a rook on the 7th rank. You'll notice with his rook here, black can't move his pawn, or he would lose his rook. And white can already dream about attacking this pawn with 2 rooks, trying to bring this rook all the way over and making a battery on the 7th rank. Maybe it won't happen in this game, but it's definitely something to consider. White played rook e1, which is a good move, attacking the pawn. Black defended it, and white has a number of good moves. He could play rook d7 here, which is again a strong move. Could play rook d5 and take this pawn. White played f4. Now, it's not really necessary to play f4 to win this pawn. You could just attack it with your rook, but white is capitalizing on the fact that there's a pin. If black plays pawn takes pawn, black will lose his rook. Black tried to preserve his pawn by playing e4, but of course white could attack it with his rook, and he would get to take it. So for example, if rook d4, if black tried to run away, white could just keep following it and then take it next move. What happened in the game is white played rook e3, which blockades the pawn. Black played his rook back, trying to get his rook in the game. White attacked the pawn. Black played rook d8. And actually now we get a pretty interesting position. So after all that, after blunders and different mistakes, we get a rook and pawn ending where white is up a pawn, but black's rook is actually quite active. And usually in a rook and pawn ending, activity is very important. So if you have a choice between passive play or active play in a rook and pawn ending, almost always choose the active plan. You'll see that this rook on d2 attacks the pawn on g2, and also, quite important, is it attacks the pawn on b2. Of course, white is defending that pawn. However, right now, white's king is tied to the defense of the b2 pawn, and that means white can't just start marching his king up the board and attacking black's pawns. If he could, his position would be quite good. What happened here is white's pawn was attacked, and he played pawn to g3. Actually, you could probably just go to g4, which is actually maybe even a little safer because from g4 it can go to g5, which is a defended square, but from g3, g4 is not defended. Just a little point to note. Black attacked it, white defended it, and now black plays king f7. So white has, right this moment, a good position. He's up a pawn, and he's, of course, the one trying to win. But he has a problem in that black has a very clear plan. Black is playing to activate his king, but white has a hard time doing the same thing. What he could do here is find a clever move, pawn to a4. The idea is that rook b3 looks pretty good at first. It attacks this pawn, which would actually fall with check right now. But black has this response, b5, which is kind of an annoying response. But if white plays this prophylactic a4, then rook b3 is going to be a stronger move. But perhaps it's not worth dwelling on each little move in this endgame, but we are going to get to see something very instructive in a second. So white played rook c3, perhaps threatening rook c7 check, and black continues to activate his king. White plays rook b3. Black plays b5. Rook plays back to c3. Well, now, actually, white's advantage is largely gone because black has been so successful in activating his king. The king is now ready to march to f5. It's coming to g4. And now black is going to be attacking this pawn with two pieces. We are going to get a position where black might even have winning chances, although the game is probably about equal. Now, of course, it's very pleasant to play when you might win the game, but at worst you have a draw. But if black is able to march his king in, take a pawn, start threatening white's other pawns here, then these kingside pawns could be very threatening. Because black's king is in the area, black's king is in the neighborhood along with the rook, and white's king is stuck on a2. Well, black played g5, and this is actually a huge mistake. Rook c6 is perhaps the best move right now. Check, attacking the king and attacking pretty much everything. But what white did is also super instructive and I think even simpler. So white just took it, black took it, white took it, black took it, and now we have a position where the entire king side has been liquidated. Well, this means that white has nothing to worry about on the king side anymore. It used to be that white was up a pawn on the king side, but he was not stronger on the king side. Let's take a look again at this position. Black is the one marching in, black's king is around, and white's king couldn't be farther from this side of the board. So black's king is in a great spot. Well, what about after this? Is black's king in a great spot anymore? Not anymore. I mean, now the pawns that are at issue are these queenside pawns. Sure, this white king can't immediately activate itself. It's still stuck to b2, but it's certainly a lot closer to the action than it was before when the action was on the king side, and this king is terribly placed. In this position, white could already play rook c6, and basically the game is over. You're threatening to take this pawn. This king is so far away. Imagine the pawn goes forward. Well, then you have rook c5 check, and you're just going to gobble these two pawns. If we play rook g3, we take this pawn. It looks like this pawn is going to fall, right? Because how is it going to be defended? If we play something like rook f3 and white attacks it, for example, here b6, black could defend it. White can bring his king in. White can also try tricks with a4 if he wants to get a little bit fancy. But I think king b3 is sufficient to not take any risks. White did not play rook c6. White played king b3. And already it's possible for black to defend. It's not an easy defense. He could start by playing king f5. He's not going to be able to take this pawn on g3 because if the rooks get exchanged, the king and pawn endgame is going to be losing because white's king is so close to these pawns and black's king is so far. So it's a delicate defense. He's going to be down a pawn and he's going to try to make it work, but white would have some winning chances. It's probably not worth getting into every detail of that position. Let's see what happens in the game. King b3, king to g4, and now white played a bad move. White played king b4. Now, the idea is terrific. The idea is to play king a5, attack this pawn, activate your king. The problem is it drops the b2 pawn. There's a couple ways to win in this position. My favorite, and the one I think makes the most sense, is rook c2. And the idea is, if the rooks get exchanged, well, here white is clearly winning because his king is so much closer and black's king is simply not in time. Just to give a sample variation, it doesn't really matter too much what black does, where he goes. He's going to lose this pawn. For example, in this position, black would have no way to defend it. Well, if he can't exchange rooks, that's a big problem. He could, of course, play rook takes g3 check. But notice that now white's rook defends the b2 pawn. And there are two possibilities. Rook c3 is possible for white, but I think the most thematic is simply king to b4. And you see now white has succeeded in activating his king. He's put his rook somewhere where it defends his weakness, and he's going to be going to a5 attacking black's weakness, and black's king is really far away. So I think white would have excellent winning chances here. But what white did was a blunder. Rook b2 check, king a5, and now black can probably draw the game. He played rook to b1. White took it. Now white's up a pawn, but the problem for him is in order to win the game, what he needs to do is trade his kingside pawn somehow for this pawn on b2. He cannot trade his a pawn for black's b pawn, because if this pawn on g3 is the extra pawn, that is not going to help him. Black's king is right in front of it. Black will simply attack it with his rook and then take it. Now, black saw this idea. He played b4, but actually this was a gross tactical error. White took it, and the game ended quickly in a draw. But what he should do is play rook c4 check. Right? Now, what has he succeeded in doing? He traded his pawn on g3 for black's pawn. And black's king is so far away that he's not going to be able to stop white's pawn. White's king is perfectly placed. Black's king is cut off. In the game, though, what happened was pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, and we see a few moves here. It doesn't matter too much. Black makes a few moves. He finally figures out, you know what? Let me simply attack the g3 pawn, and it's captured, and the game ends in a draw. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the game. If you'd like to send in your games for analysis, please see the email address below or in the profile. Thank you so much.